Hello. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Melbourne Museum. Thank you for joining us to explore the secret history of sharks with Professor John Long. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today, the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to any First Peoples in the audience with us today. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the instructions of museum staff. They'll guide us to the nearest evacuation point and then we head out to the plaza. Tonight we are excited to be discussing John Long's new book, The Secret History of Sharks. My name is Kate Phillips and I had the pleasure of working with John when he worked here at Museums Victoria. And since then, he's headed off to work overseas at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. Now he's a professor of palaeontology at Flinders University, and that's home to one of the largest paleontological research groups. John is a prolific writer both for the scientific audience and for the general public. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed papers, 25 books and 150 popular science articles. And John's field of research is the evolution of fishes, and he's made a significant discovery about the origins of sex. And these have been published in Nature, Science and Scientific American. And this really has cemented his reputation as a leading figure in evolutionary biology. So we're very thrilled to have John back at the museum again tonight. Tonight we will be having this chat here until 7:30. And we'll start off with a bit of a conversation and I'll be speaking to John about some of the main themes in the book. But then we will have plenty of time for your questions. So if you would like to add a question, you can do that at any time through the Slido interactive thing that you access to on your phone. So you can submit your questions using the code #shark to 811. You'll see that up there on the screen. And as well as putting your own questions in, you can vote for other people's questions. So if someone else has asked a question that you find interesting or one perhaps that you thought you might ask yourself, just vote for their question and it'll pop up to the top and I'll be able to see that lots of people are interested in that. After the event, John will hold a book signing just outside here. So you can, if you would like to buy a copy of the book, you can get one and get it signed by John and perhaps also have a little chat with him if you've got some other questions. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Long.
Right, it's great to be here and back in Museum Victoria again.
It's great to have you here, John. And this is the book. I only started reading it about a week ago and I found it very captivating. So we're going to start off with a question. Why write the book and why now?
Very good question. And people often ask me, why is it called The Secret History of Sharks? Well, there's loads of books out there on paleontology, especially dinosaurs. There's dozens of them published every year. How many books have ever been published on the prehistory of sharks? The answer, 1, this book. So it wasn't even my idea. I was contacted by an agent in New York who thought of the idea that why hasn't anyone ever written the story of sharks through time? And so they approached me as a potential author to write the book. And I said, yeah, I've been working on fossil fishes all my life. I can certainly do a job on sharks. So that began a sort of 5-year immersion studying deeply researching the history of sharks, their palaeontology over 500 million years, and more importantly, travelling around the world to visit collections in the Natural History Museum in London and some of the big museums in America and Europe in order to look at specimens and get the stories right from the collections.
And this is a very active research area. And I believe that just before you were going to press, you said, "Stop the presses. I've discovered that there's something new that's just come out that I really need to include in the book." Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, the thing about researching a book is at the moment the book's published, the damn thing's already out of date, because science just works like that. Science is not, this is the answer to anything. This is the answer as far as we know with the data we've got. So as the book was going to press, and I was doing the audio book, which I narrated over 7 days in the studio with braces on my teeth, I dare say, was pretty challenging. Eventually, a big discovery was made in Mexico of this gigantic fossil shark that was thought to be 10 metres long, and it had a mouthful of giant crushing tooth plates, like crenulated half cricket balls, if you like. And for years and years and years, nobody knew what this thing looked like. And suddenly they found the complete shark. And everybody guessed it was some sort of ancient primitive shark that had no bearing on living sharks. But it turned out to be a lamniform closely related to the line that gave rise to the great white sharks. But instead of a mouthful of sharp, serrated teeth, it had a mouthful of crushing tooth plates. So it was eating these big, coily shells that lived in the seas during the age of dinosaurs called ammonites, like a squid with a big, coily shell. And it had these crushing tooth plates to eat these really large ammonites, because ammonites in those days got up to nearly 2 metres in diameter, like equivalent to a giant squid today.
Fantastic. So science is very lively. And there are some people in the audience who might be thinking about going into this area of research, or might already be in this area of research, and you could be making some of those next discoveries that feed into our understanding of the evolutionary puzzle. Now, I must admit that I am not quite such a shark fan. I believe we have lots of shark fans in the audience, because I went round and talked to a few of you, and so we have lots of people who really love sharks. I guess I probably relate a little bit more to things like dolphins and whales. But when I started reading your book, I got a really new appreciation for sharks and for what they are as amazing survivors and as living creatures. And I really like the way that you talked about some of the shark superpowers. So that was a new way of thinking about sharks for me. Could you tell us a little bit about those? The two top superpowers that you pull out is one of them is to do with the teeth, and the other is to do with how they smell.
That's right. So one of the success stories for sharks is their ability to grow lots and lots of teeth. So we humans grow 2 sets of teeth. We all know our milk teeth when we're a baby that we shed when we're in our young years, and we go through the horrible thing of having our teeth being replaced, and then we're stuck with that set of teeth for life. With sharks, they can produce rows and rows of teeth and keep shedding them through their entire life. So one shark could grow as many as 20,000 to 30,000 teeth. And by shedding them all the time, it means they make excellent fossils. They fall to the bottom of the sea floor or whatever environment the shark was living in. And, if one shark can produce 20 or 30,000 teeth, that means there's more chance of finding them as fossils in the rocks. So it's why sharks' teeth can be quite abundant in certain layers. So the superpower there is to always have a sharp tooth or a row of teeth that's always permanently sharp. Because if a tooth gets blunt or breaks, they just drop it and pop up a new one. And some sharks can do this on an average of replacing a new tooth every 2 days. So it's quite remarkable. And not just the ability to create amazingly sharp new teeth all the time, but it's the dental plasticity, the genetic ability to form many different kinds of teeth with many different kinds of tissues. So some of the shark's teeth, like this one of the giant crushing shark that was 10 metres long that lived in the age of dinosaurs called Tychodus, had incredibly hard teeth that could crush really, really solid things. So that's one of their abilities that made them able to adapt and develop many different sort of dietary preferences. So when a mass extinction struck, they were able to cope, and some of them could then bounce back. So there's an interesting fact. There's been 5 major mass extinctions that have completely rewritten the story of life on this planet over the last 500 million years. And sharks are the only group of vertebrates or backboned animals on the planet to have survived all 5 of those mass extinction events. And they did it through a variety of ways. Now, I could spend a whole hour talking about that, but it's in the book, and I go into great detail what caused each of these mass extinction events with the latest scientific research, and what we think is the reason why sharks actually survived it. Now, the second superpower is smell, olfaction. If you look at a white shark's brain, the olfactory organs, which are how they sense the chemicals in the water, the sense of smell, these parts of the brain of senses of smell, these olfactory bulbs, are about 18% the total weight of the brain, or nearly 20%. So it's massive. They're like swimming noses, basically. And so sharks, when they swim, move their heads from side to side. And why they're doing that is because they can sense minute differences of where that smell is coming from in the water from left to right. So they can keep doing that and hone in eventually on where the prey is. And one of the sort of the age-old myths about sharks is, oh, they can smell a drop of blood in the water from like 5 kilometres away. There's no real truth in that, but their ability is still quite extraordinary. I mean, the element of truth in it really is that we have detected sharks in the wild, white sharks, that if there's a strong current of blood and bits of macerated flesh in the water, such as people burleying the water, and a current takes it, then they can actually detect that from up to 6 kilometres away. And that was observed in a shark in South Australia, where it was swimming along and it detected the plume floating on a current from 6 kilometres away. It turned left immediately and went straight up the middle of that plume back to the boat. So they do have quite extraordinary sense of smell, given if the conditions are right. And things like hammerheads with these massive eyes and, more importantly, nasal organs on the end of those hammers can use that sense of smell, almost like stereoscopic vision, to hone in more precisely when they're swimming at speed. So that's the advantage of the hammerhead's hammer.
That gave me a really new appreciation for the sharks in the water and the way moving their head and sensing where a smell was coming from, or where a chemical was coming from. And I guess us being terrestrial animals, animals that live on land, we don't necessarily immediately relate to aquatic and marine animals, because we sort of have a rather different sensory system. But that makes a lot of sense, that you'd need to be able to detect what was in the water. And I believe that sharks can also detect quite a lot once they bite something.
Yeah, well, a couple of other senses sharks have that's really extraordinary. One is electroreception, so they can actually detect the electric fields of a living creature. Now, these are very weak, minute kind of pulses of electricity. It is kind of the equivalent of detecting a AA battery in the water from like several hundred kilometres away, but up close it's detecting such a weak electric field from about a metre away. And the advantages of this are that because it only works when the shark is close to its prey, it means things like hammerheads or bonnethead sharks have these big rounded heads full of electroreceptors. They can sweep the bottom of the sea floor like minesweepers and find fish that are buried in the sand, or crabs. So they can find prey that's not visible, or you can't detect any smell, but they can actually detect the living electric field. So that's quite remarkable. But the other one you mentioned, there was electroreception and... Sorry?
Well, I was talking about thinking about
smell.
the smell and the taste.
The taste,
and
that's right.
And the sensory kind of information.
I'm right onto it. I got sidetracked. Taste buds. Where are your taste buds? Anyone? On your tongue. Right. So if we bite something, we have to kind of lick it to get a flavour of what we're eating. What if your taste buds were behind your rows of teeth? So every time you bit something, you tasted it. And that's exactly what they've just discovered through new research, that sharks have this ability. They've developed taste buds. No, they've got them on the tongue, of course, but they've also got them behind the first rows of teeth and the back of the palate. So when a shark chomps something, it's tasting it. Unfortunately for us, they can accidentally chomp on a human if they're, you know, a surfer or something on the leg, and they may not like what they taste, and they may not come back, but they've already done the damage. And so many of the shark encounters with humans that are fatal or you know, cause great damage are really just accidentally tasting something.
You don't want to be tasted by a shark if you can avoid it.
We call it negative human-shark encounters. We don't call them shark attacks because sharks don't attack things, they just eat things, and that's not an aggressive thing, it's just what they do to survive. So calling it a shark attack is a human term for making it sound aggressive. You know, like they're out to kill something. You know, they're not, they're just out to eat something.
Fantastic. Now, we've got a question here which is about some of the earliest sharks and how they relate to modern day sharks. Yep. But I'd really be interested to know in what, you know, what clues we have about those early sharks and what they evolved from and, what sort of creatures were they?
Okay, well, the first 50-odd million years of the fossil record of sharks, which dates back to what we call the Ordovician period, the oldest remains of shark-like fishes, and I'll call them that, I can't say they're definite sharks, and I'll tell you why in a sec, are tiny little scales that come from Central Australia, near Alice Springs. I've actually been to the site. It's out in the desert there. It took lots of four-wheel driving. Had a tent set up. I was digging away all day, and then a storm came, blew away my tent. It was a really rugged field trip, I can tell you that. I found some bones there that went into the museum collections, but these shark scales were discovered about 20 years after that trip of mine, which was 1993, I think. So these tiny microscopic scales are identical to the scales of living sharks. They're unique in their fact that they're different from all other types of living fish scales. So we know they're shark-like fishes, but hey, if you've only got the scales, you don't know anything else. You can't really say it's a definite shark. But based on the tissues and the shape of those placoid scales, they're so similar to living sharks that they have to be a shark-like thing. All right, so in that 50 million year period, we find one complete shark-like fish from China, and it's illustrated in the book. It's called Xenacanthus, and it was only discovered 2 years ago, literally while I was writing the book. It's a complete little fish. It's only 3 centimetres long, the complete fish. And the head of this tiny shark-like fish is covered in bony armoured plates, which no shark today has. And it's got pointed spines sticking out of all of its fins. So what we call these are stem sharks. So imagine the tree of life, you know, the evolution from primitive sharks to modern sharks as a tree. Then you've got the main branch leading up to living sharks. So that's what we call the branch leading to living sharks. Coming off there are all sorts of stems off that tree that go nowhere. They're dead ends. And we've got some of these things from that period that look a little bit like sharks, but they don't meet the criteria of living sharks. You know, there's certain types of cartilage that living sharks have as unique, a type of globular calcified cartilage. It's totally different from the cartilage in your skeleton that you have in your ears or your nose or your hip joints, the synovial joints. We have our own types of cartilage, and sharks have their type of cartilage built of tiny little tiles which give them incredible strength. It's sort of like Kevlar cartilage. It's incredibly strong and light. So way back in the early days of fish evolution, many fish went for bony armoured plates, you know, like the giant placoderms and the bony fish today. Sharks went the opposite way. They started off with bony plates, got rid of them, and lightened the entire skeleton so they were light, agile and fast. And that was the advantage they had over other fishes of the time.
Thank you, John. Now, I know that as a paleontologist, you spend a lot of time imagining life in the past, and particularly, I believe, the Devonian is a time when it's been, because of your work on things like the go-go fossils in WA, that's been a really significant time. Could you talk a little bit more about what we now know about both the fish and sharks of that period, and some of the, then lead on to some of the newest discoveries?
Absolutely. Well, the Devonian's my favourite period. I mean, if you look at a geological timescale, there's the Devonian, there's the pre-Devonian and the post-Devonian, because the Devonian's where everything happened. I mean, 60 million years of Earth history, starting at 419 million years ago and ending at about precisely 359 million years ago. That 60 million years Earth was transformed totally. I mean, plants were just mosses and lichens at the beginning of the Devonian. By the end of the Devonian, there were forests 30, 40 metres high, covering the Earth kind of thing. Life on land got established with insects and giant sort of centipedes and millipedes and things like that.
You've got one of their ancestors bothering you. I'm sorry about that.
So in the seas, what happened is fish really took off. And the early days, they call it the age of fishes, because anywhere in the world where you were digging and you found marine or freshwater rocks, you'd find the remains of fishes. That's the first time they actually become abundant, relative to the rocks older than the Devonian. So not just fishes, but by the end of the Devonian, we had tetrapods, or the first four-limbed animals, like early amphibians. And I described one of these fishes in a paper in Nature a couple of years ago called Elpistostegi from Canada, that not only had, these fishes had the humerus, ulna and radius in their front fins that you have in your forearm. They also have the carpal bones and digit bones. So we discovered the finger bones in fishes evolved before they invaded land, and that was one of our big discoveries. So much happened in the Devonian, including sharks radiating out. So we get the first sharks in that period with real teeth, like modern sharks' teeth, that were replaced. And we know this because you find them in great abundance in certain layers, and you can see from the wear on them that they were replaced fairly frequently. About 10 times slower than modern sharks, but nonetheless, it was the beginning of the conveyor belt type dentition in sharks. And by the middle of that Devonian period, we get the first true sharks, what we call the Eucelachians, the modern sharks that are characterised by that particular kind of cartilage that's globular and calcified and leaves a pattern wherever you find it as a fossil. But I found a shark at Gogo up in the Kimberley that was three-dimensional and perfectly preserved from its cartilage skeletons, that you could etch it with acid out of the rock as three-dimensional bones that you could study. And when we studied the microstructure of that shark, we found it had something that we never expected to find. It was beautiful cartilage, but it also had remnant bone cells, osteocytes, between the layers of cartilage. So it's kind of the smoking gun, showing that early sharks had lots of bone in their skeleton, but you get to later sharks where they're losing all that bone and becoming all cartilage, but some of them still had remnant abilities to make bone cells. So that was quite a big, exciting discovery for us, and I called that shark Gogo Salakis, meaning shark from Gogo.
That's a completely new view for me also about the advantages of having cartilage, and that, this idea of a bit really streamlining as well. I wonder if you could talk about the other really interesting significant discovery that's really, I guess, important for our own evolution as well, in terms of the discovery that then put you in the Guinness Book of Records.
Oh, right. That happened while I was right here at Museum Victoria. I've been working this site at Gogo for the last, 38 years. I was back up there this year in August. And why I keep going back, it's a site in the Kimberley where fossil fishes of the Devonian age, you think of a fish that's nearly 400 million years old and they're, squashed flat in rock and they're kind of hard to interpret. Unlike Gogo, where they're three-dimensional and perfect, you actually find the fish inside a rock that's formed a concretion around it literally days after the thing died, because it was a tropical warm sea on the equator rich in certain chemicals that formed around the skeleton of the carcass as it was decaying. So now we get the skeleton inside a nodule that we put in acid, and then you get the three-dimensional skeleton out. You can see some wonderful examples of these in the museum here in the fossil gallery. All of them were collected by me during 2 expeditions back in 2005, 2008. So you can just see why they're so three-dimensional. So the discovery that Kate's alluding to was we discovered a fish on the 2005 trip that had a series of little bones inside it. And at first I thought, oh my God, this is the last meal of this fish. It was an ancient extinct fish called a placoderm, so they're no longer around today. They died out at the end of the Devonian. And then we discovered, by looking closely, that wasn't the last meal. It was an embryo, an unborn embryo. And how do we know? Because we actually found the umbilical cord still linking to it, mineralised. And when we looked at the tiny bones again, we saw they were replicas of the adult skeleton. So this was an embryo inside a group of extinct animals, like a whole order of animals, like, you know, the only known group, placoderms, we didn't know anything about their reproduction. And then we discovered that they were giving birth to live young. We thought, that's interesting. That's really interesting. We didn't expect that in a primitive fish. We'd expect them to be spawning in water like trout. And then we discovered by going back to the collections that other groups of placoderms also had embryos in them. So 3 other groups, and then we realised it was widespread in the group. But the most important thing about that is it pinpoints the origin of intimate sex in animals, because up until then we had no evidence of copulation or mating by what we call internal fertilisation until those discoveries. So I didn't know this, but the Guinness Book of Records picked it up from all the worldwide publicity we got from we got 4 Nature papers out of that series of discoveries, and they put it in the Guinness Book of Records as the record for the world's oldest birth.
So again, I mean,
live birth.
Yes, I mean, again, that's fantastic in terms of the, you know, understanding the evolution of those particular creatures. But it has the story that leads right up to modern day animals, including ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. This is the beginning of that behaviour in evolution that started in placoderms and went right through to humans, along with many other structures that they first evolved. So placoderms were a bit like dinosaurs. They were thought to be like a dead-end lineage with no use to biology today. And then when they discovered that dinosaurs gave rise to birds, suddenly everyone got interested in studying dinosaurs again. Well, placoderms have just gone through a renaissance of interest in science. And there's lots and lots of discoveries we've made that show that the things that we thought were not related to the human body plan are actually all originated first in these ancient placoderms, which were the rivals of sharks in the Devonian. They kept sharks at bay. Sharks were not the top dogs in the Devonian because these gigantic placoderms like Dunkleosteus, probably between 4 to 6 metres long, were ruling the roost. And placoderms, when they went extinct, sharks could simply just take off and take over the world, and that's what they did.
So sharks were the underdogs for a long time.
A couple of times in their history. Once in the Devonian with these other placoderms, and then again for about 160 odd million years during the age of dinosaurs, when gigantic marine reptiles invaded the seas, like the gigantic plesiosaurs and the mosasaurs, which were related to goannas, like varanid lizards with paddles up to 20 metres long. All of these things were way bigger than any sharks in the oceans at that time. And they were the top predators of the ocean. So sharks were the underdogs then until they went extinct. And then sharks bounced back again. And out of that bounce back came the biggest, meanest predator of all time, the Megalodon.
Well, I think we have to talk a little bit about the Megalodon, because I think there are a few people in our audience who'd really like to hear a bit more about the Megalodon. And in fact, I think you might be in for a little bit of a surprise, perhaps.
Well, it's interesting. We all thought we knew a lot about Megalodon. There's been some new books published about it, but the most interesting thing about Megalodon is what's been discovered in the last 2 years, including this year, 2024. Some very important peer-reviewed research papers came out by large teams of experts in America and England, and even Australia were on the co-authors on this paper. The first one proved that Megalodon was warm-blooded. They looked at a new technique for what's called clumped paleoisotope thermometry, where you look at the temperatures of bonds forming in the cartilage, in the tissues. And this is based on straight chemistry, that chemical bonds are how cartilage and tissues form. And today you can measure the temperatures that they form in living animals and then do the same analysis of the isotopes of the extinct tissues, the teeth, and find the temperatures these creatures form those bonds. Megalodon had a warm-blooded temperature of 28 degrees Celsius, so not quite as warm as us. We are 36 as mammals, but nonetheless a constantly warm-blooded gigantic shark. That would have given it great advantage to going higher latitudes, both south and north, to hunt whales, its favourite food. The other thing we learned about Megalodon, and this is by studying the one known skeleton. Most people think Megalodon's only known from its teeth. There's actually one skeleton of Megalodon, which consists of 140 odd vertebrae joined together in Belgium, in the Belgian Museum of Natural History. And everyone previously that had studied this series of giant calcified vertebrae had thought that it had a very short tail. And then someone came along and restudied it and did really detailed study of the skeleton of white sharks and so on. And they realised everyone had made a mistake. The tail was actually much longer relative to the previous reconstruction. So when you put all this together, the new model of Megalodon is that it looks nothing like a white shark. Every movie you've ever seen, from The Meg and all of these, there's dozens of films coming out, they all portray Megalodon as a white shark on steroids. It had a long, slender body, more like a basking shark, and it even had slower swimming speeds than modern white sharks. We can calculate these swimming speeds based on the scales, which have 3 riblets on them. Like mako sharks are the fastest swimming sharks in the oceans today, and they have hydrodynamic surface on their scales that kind of tells you the drag and the resistance in the water. And very elaborate calculations have been done by scientists that can calculate the swimming speeds of sharks based on their scales. We have scales of Megalodon, we have vertebrae of Megalodon, and we have teeth. And from that, it was probably swimming about only two-thirds as fast as a white shark in terms of its cruising speed, but it certainly could cruise right around the globe because its teeth have been found in every continent except Antarctica, and they had also been found in nurseries where we had populations of young megalodons living in the Caribbean and certain parts of North America.
So finding a fossil shark tooth is something that's really exciting. And one of our questions was, John, was how you started off in studying this area, and did finding a fossil tooth have a part in this story? It
did. I mean, I grew up in Melbourne. My parents were urban gypsies, so we moved around a lot, but we lived a lot around Mordialloc, Seaford, Carrum, that area. And this is a shark's tooth of an extinct kind of white shark called Carcharodon hastalis, and it's from Beaumaris, where I used to go virtually every weekend between the ages of 8 and 14 or 15 looking for shark's teeth. And snorkeling around in the shallows, if you know what to look for, often you'll find them, they'll be completely covered in algae and marine growth, and then you simply pop them in vinegar overnight and get rid of that, and then you get a nice clean shark's tooth like this one. I found over 20 different species and wrote projects on it for the Victorian Science Talent Search, and I won the top prize when I was 13 for my 200-page book on fossil
so
fish.
He was already publishing books at the age of 13.
13 was the 200 pages on fossils of Victoria, and then the next one, I only won a $10 prize for a 100-page book just on fossil fishes of Australia. But I tried.
You're becoming more specialised. We've got a question here, which is, what is your favourite shark? Is this like asking, what is your favourite child? I don't know.
Favourite shark, living or extinct? It's got to be helicoprion, the buzzsaw shark. Do you all know helicoprion?
No.
Helicoprion's this monstrous shark that was at least 8 to 10 metres in length, and its lower jaw, instead of having rows and rows and rows of teeth, they coalesced into one big whorl that looked like a sort of a buzzsaw, like the teeth growing out. Some of these teeth are up to, in the old scale, 5 inches or whatever that is in centimetres, deeply serrated like a white shark teeth, and they just grow in a single line coming out of the shark's lower jaw. Now, for over 150 years, people found these gigantic wheels of teeth the size of this table, nearly a metre across, and they didn't know what the shark did with it and how did it feed or how did it use this set of jaws, because they just basically found the tooth whorls by themselves. And this Russian scientist called Alexander Kopinski, he was the world expert on helicoprion. He found the first complete teeth of it in Russia in the Perm Mountains, where the Permian stage is named, back in the 1890s. And he still didn't know in his whole life what this thing was used for. And it was only recently the problem was solved, as recently as 2013, when they discovered a slab of rock with a tooth whorl of this giant shark. And they realised that inside this slab was probably the skull and the whole head of this thing. They put it through a synchrotron and big CT scanners, and they were able to reconstruct the brain case, the jaws, and saw that it had this scissor-like action on the lower jaw that could protrude this set of deadly teeth and then catch its prey and whip it back into its mouth. And it was probably a highly specialised thing that fed on squid and giant ammonite-type things, like squid-like creatures in shells. But I asked the world expert on this creature called Leaf tapanilla in America. He's from the University of Idaho. I said, well, you know, if it did that, surely the teeth would wear down on the shell. And he said, well, I've examined over 10,000 teeth of Helicoprion on individual specimens, and none of them show tooth wear, like the teeth aren't wearing down. Any sharks that's a predator that bites things hard, like great whites, they often, even this one, they often have the tip of the sharp tooth part broken off because of the sheer pressure of, you know, a bite on a hard thing. But not for Helicoprion. So he seems to think they were just targeting soft squid, not even the ones in shells that were very abundant in those seas at the time. And of course, it went extinct with the Great Dying at the end of the Permian, the biggest mass extinction event of the whole world, when almost 96% of all species in the oceans went extinct. So that's when they bombed out.
Wow, so that's kind of like shooting out the teeth and kind of hooking onto the squid.
You have to look at the pictures in the book. There are some nice diagrams that some of my colleagues have given me that show the latest reconstructions of these sharks in terms of the skull structure and the teeth and how they sort of fit together, yeah.
Wow. Now, one of our other questions here asks, what has been your favourite shark collection to visit?
Favourite shark collection? When I started writing this book, I went to the British Museum in London and spent 3 days pulling out every single drawer of all their entire fossil shark collection. And that was just refreshing my brain about, you know, the fossils, the specimens. I've also looked at shark fossils in museums in America and Europe and Australia, of course, but it's one of the best collections in the world because it's been accumulated from so many different places over so many years that it was just ground zero. It was the best fossil shark collection to start with. But in America, the museum where I used to work at the LA County Museum have got some of the most amazing Miocene sharks and whales from sites in North America. So that really sharpened up my knowledge of those recently extinct sharks.
We have a question here about which sharks do you think would be able to survive the current mass extinction event and why?
Oh, well, that's a good question. The book has 2 chapters dealing with living sharks. There's a whole chapter on white sharks, which I was very fortunate to be able to go out and see in a cage diving experience off South Australia. I spent 4 days out there looking at about 8 different white sharks. And they're really beautiful creatures when you see them up close. They're each individuals with personality, battle scars. Some of them have, you know, suffered incredible wounds from propellers and things like that, but still managed to survive. The definite threat is us, mainly through overfishing and accidental bycatch of large commercial fisheries that go out to catch tuna and other sort of, or, you know, other kinds of Patagonian sea basses and things like that. But so many sharks are caught as bycatch that are just killed, and they don't even, in many countries, they don't even record the amount. In America, they do, and there's accurate reports each year of how much weight per tonne of bycatch, whether they be turtles or dolphins or sharks, are caught and died during the process. But it's us humans, really. We are polluting the oceans. There's massive amounts of microplastic. The Great Pacific Gyres, huge accumulations where all the currents have amassed several thousand tonnes of microplastics in these areas. So we don't really know the effect of those microplastics on the livelihood of sharks, but we know it's not good from what they do to filter feeding oysters and clams. They reduce the fertility rates. A third of all shark species known on the planet are endangered or threatened. Now, if you think of all the groups of vertebrate animals, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, etc., the most threatened animals at the moment on the CITES Red List are amphibians. Frogs are being hammered all around the world, and you know we've lost so many species of frogs in recent decades due to changes of habitat or over clearing and things like that. Sharks are next on the list. They're the second most endangered group of backboned animals on the planet. Many species, for example, we know they're on the way out and they're going to go extinct. There's nothing we can do to save them. And I talk about some of these species in the last chapter of the book. Even when regulations are brought in by countries to protect them, they're just ignored. Many of the third world countries need sharks as food and they just ignore the regulations and catch them and sell them anyway. But a lot of recent work is being done on sharks and temperatures and how they're going to cope with rising sea temperatures as well. And that's going to put a bit of pressure on some of the species as well, because you think about rising temperatures about another 2 degrees of the oceans, and that's putting certain sharks, like epaulet sharks and some of the smaller species, into what's called the PAJUS, P-E-J-U-S, or it's a temperature where the body starts going into loss of fitness, reproductive fitness. And there's been good experiments done, because you can keep these little sharks in aquaria and you can keep them in different temperatures for long periods, and you can study their reproduction abilities and rates, and that's what that study's based on. But rather than talk about something so negative, let's talk about something positive, about what do sharks actually contribute to human welfare? What do they give us as a species? And there's some amazing things I've been able to find in the book. They've only recently looked at the genome, that's the entire genetic package of the great white shark. It was only published in 2019. And they found that these things have incredibly powerful immune systems. They have an immune system like a T-Rex. They can survive cancers and all sorts of things. It's quite incredible. So there's been a lot of attention to studying their genetic makeup, which genes they have that give them this resilience and this ability to bounce back after injuries and wounds and so on. Like the ones I saw off Port Lincoln that have lots of horrible scars on them, but they somehow heal and just keep going on. That's one thing. The other thing is that they've done recent studies, and this was ever since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've discovered that nurse sharks have resistance to all coronaviruses. They have the antibody immunity to all coronaviruses. This was only published, I think, in 2021 in a medical journal. It's cited in the book. But, you know, these kind of studies are really interesting. We find out, well, why does this shark have resistance to known coronaviruses? Because it's got smaller immune proteins, antibodies, than, say, humans and mammals. So, you know, there's something we can learn there that could help us cope with the next pandemic, whatever it is. But my favourite example of sharks in human medicine is definitely the whale shark. This discovery is literally only about 2 years old, and it was published in the journal Science. So does anyone here know anyone who's got night blindness? Night blindness is a thing that it's rare in humans, but quite a few people have it, that in low light conditions in darkness, when most of us can still see, some people just lose their vision. They totally lose their vision. They've just discovered that whale sharks, when they dive deep into the oceans, and they can go down 3 kilometres into the ocean depths. They don't always stay in the surface. And they have a pigment in their eye, a blue, rhodopsin blue, that turns on at a certain depth. It's not so much the depth, it's the temperature that triggers it. And then it's like putting on military night glasses. They can see clearly what's in their environment. It's an amazing ability, and it's only just been discovered. And they think that with the genes that turn that on and off, that humans have the same genes, that maybe then humans with night blindness could be treated by temperature therapy to try and activate that gene. So all sorts of things like that. And there's only a sample in the book of some of the things sharks contribute. But there's many, many examples of how the study of sharks is becoming increasingly more important to understanding human medicine.
Wow, that's something I'd never heard of before. We hear about finding medicines in corals or in tropical reefs or venomous animals, but the amazing stories about sharks are new to me. One of the other innovations that you talk about in the book is something that has developed from the shark's skin. And has an application in aerospace. Yeah. Now, when I first wrote the book, I wrote pages and pages and pages about Olympic athletes. There's one in the front row, actually. My brother-in-law, Rowan Robinson, was in Atlanta and Sydney with hurdles. But Olympic athletes, right? Olympic swimming suits were the big thing, Michael Phelps. And suddenly, when they did the physics of these suits, they realised that they were an unfair advantage because of drag reduction in the water, so they banned them. You know, they got up to 28% increased water reduction, so they could just cream the opposition. They realised this is too unfair to have these kinds of suits. Anyway, where did shark skin swimsuits come from? Well, the name is in the shark skin. It was the study of the drag reduction on shark scales through the water. Now, the Germans
first cottoned onto this back in the 1970s and 80s, and there was a very brilliant German scientist called Wolf Reif, and unfortunately he was born with spina bifida, so he had this debilitating disease all his life. But he studied living sharks as well as fossil shark scales, and he worked out that, you know, the riblets on the scales were crucial to calculating how fast these things were going because of the drag in the water. And then he teamed up with a brilliant German physicist, Dietrich Baychart, who then took it to the realm of physics to do experimental trials with water flow columns and all of this. And they actually quantified the maximum efficiency for drag from a particular kind of film. They produced this, and it's now covering every Lufthansa cargo aeroplane in the entire world. They've reduced emissions by something like 10,000 tonnes of CO2 per year, and they save fuel, just based on AeroShark, it's called. They announced this in 2022. The inspiration came from a palaeontologist studying fossil sharks, and he's credited with the discovery on their webpage. So, yeah, that's another wonderful thing we've got from sharks.
So we've really got to learn from sharks, and they can give us insights into how we can have a sustainable future. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about what happens when we don't have sharks, when sharks are overfished or taken out of ecosystems. What's the effect of that?
Well, sharks provide lots of what we call ecosystem services to keep the ocean healthy. I mean, imagine Africa without any lions or any top predators. What's going to happen? The herbivores get out of control, they eat all the grass, they eat all the fruits and things, and your ecosystem goes to hell in a handbag pretty quickly. Well, they've just discovered that sharks are vitally important to keep reefs healthy. And in keeping reefs healthy, they keep fisheries alive and healthy, because many reefs are protected, and that's where fish breed that then can repopulate the fishes we like to commercially fish and eat. They've just discovered that sharks are critically endangered on reefs around the world. There was a paper published in Nature in 2020 that put cameras on 300 reefs around the world and recorded over a year photographically how many sharks were on these reefs. And they found that about 20% of all the reefs of the world that had sharks have no longer got sharks anymore, which is a real worry. So what do sharks do on reefs? Well, it's quite simple. Lots of fish live on reefs that love to eat coral, because coral is a rich source of nutrition. And different wrasses and these wrasses and labrid fish have grinding mills in their gullet. They actually chomp off bits of coral and they excrete out fine white sands. And so, you know, they eat the coral and they also create nice sandy floors from the particles that they don't dissolve, but they, you know, crap out, shall we say. These fish, though, if they're not trained by sharks, can get out of control. They can totally destroy a reef. That's one example. The other example is the tiger sharks in West Australia. This is a lovely example. I got this from David Attenborough, actually. I quote him in the book. It was one of his quotes from one of his shows, where he showed that the area around Ningaloo and Exmouth Bay in West Australia, one of my favourite parts of Australia. I used to live in WA for nearly 20 years. Is the largest area of seagrass matting, literally, in the world. The seagrasses there are really extensive, and dugongs feed on them. Tiger sharks come around there, they're very abundant, and turtles like to feed on this seagrass. The tiger sharks come along and they keep the turtles moving, so they don't just graze the seagrass out in any one area. And they eat the turtles occasionally, and they keep the population down. So why is seagrass so important? They've just discovered that seagrass can draw down 30 times as much carbon dioxide per square metre or square kilometre than rainforest, tropical rainforest. So it's one of the most important ways of drawing down excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And sharks are doing their job by moving those turtles around and keeping that population in check. So yeah, that's just one of the many ways that they also mix nutrients from one zone of the ocean to another, so that nutrients in the top surface area can be carried on to another area. And like all top apex predators, they keep everything below on the food chain in the right balance that's required to keep oceans healthy.
So we really need a campaign, Save the Sharks, to save the humans.
Yeah, there are campaigns, many of them out there already.
Yes.
And the other good thing is, of course, people used to be terrified of sharks, and many people are, but The shark tourism industry is absolutely booming. It's one of the biggest industries where sharks are worth hundreds of millions of dollars globally to the economy. I mean, just take South Australia. The shark tourism industry there is worth about $20 million a year to Point Lincoln. It's the only place in the world you can go into a cage that goes to the bottom and see white sharks in their natural environment. In recent years, shark tourism has opened up in Ireland and Scotland. Huge schools of basking sharks up to 10 metres long each. You can swim with them. They're harmless. And you pay money, go on a boat, swim with the basking sharks. We know about whale sharks in Ningaloo. That's a huge tourist attraction. Think of the other big terrifying sharks, bull sharks, hammerheads, tiger sharks. There's different parts of the world now where you can do a tour and go swimming with all of these sharks in relatively safe conditions.
Can you have hands up for anyone who likes that idea?
I want to do it.
There you go. You've got a good tourist market here.
At age 66, I got my scuba diving open water certification this year and went swimming with Galapagos sharks off Lord Howe Island. That was wonderful. They're only little, though.
Yes. So for our own fascination, we want to keep sharks, but also actually for the health of ecosystems on which we entirely depend.
And the more people that go out on these shark tourism trips, the more people actually start to bond and understand them. And they get the whole lesson about, well, why is this shark important? And you come back and you're a different person. It certainly was one of the things that life-changing for me, going to spend 4 days out on the Rodney Fox shark expeditions and just watch white sharks in their natural environment. It's fantastic.
So we need to make the planet safe for sharks.
Well, sharks are just part of many creatures. You know, we can't specialise sharks out or, you know, take them out, make them too special.
Sure. But we need to make the planet good for frogs. We need to make the planet good for trees. We need to make the planet good for, you know, a whole range of... But it's like sort of like, if that's your starting point, is it's actually about ensuring that we've got a planet where healthy populations can continue and remain in... diverse enough and in ecological balance.
Yeah, and it's not just sharks, it's fish and whales, dolphins, it's all creatures. I mean, you know, if everything's in the right balance, then things keep producing the things that we humans need for our future.
Yes. I'll just come back to a question which I think we partially answered, but it was about which sharks do you think would be able to survive the current mass extinction? I guess it's about which sharks are most perhaps adaptable or tough?
Well, it's very complex, but let's talk about which sharks have survived the longest that are alive today is probably a good way to phrase that question. White sharks have only been around, they're the newest kids on the block. Literally, they've only been around 5 or 6 million years, according to the fossil record, which is quite accurate because of those thousands and thousands of teeth that get shed in the sediment. One shark has been around for 150 million years, virtually unchanged. The fossils are perfect, complete sharks, the tail, the outline, the fins, the head, everything. And these are Port Jackson sharks or horn sharks. They haven't changed in 150 million years since the age of the dinosaurs. The same genus, Heterodontus, has been around, found beautifully preserved in these German deposits called Sollenhofen, where Archaeopteryx, one of the first birds, was found, you know, absolutely perfect. Some of them have got the colour banding preserved on them. There's also beautiful sharks preserved in Italy, in the mountains up north of Verona, a place called Bolca. And I went to this site a couple of years ago, and beautiful complete sharks with the skin preserved and the colour banding on the tips of the fins. And they're 50 million years old. Reef sharks, taupe sharks actually, that are around today. And they haven't changed much in 50 million years. But yeah, goblin sharks haven't changed much. They've been around for about 120 million years. Saw sharks haven't changed much. They've been around for about 110 million years. So when you go through the book, you'll learn that it starts off with these really weird and strange archaic sharks that look nothing like living sharks kind of thing. And then by the time you get to the age of dinosaurs, about halfway through the existence of sharks in terms of their timeline, the modern sharks start appearing. And they all appear during the age of dinosaurs. None of them go extinct when the dinosaurs went extinct. They just sail through that extinction boundary like it didn't happen. So sharks are the ultimate survivors.
Fantastic. Now, we're almost coming to the end of our time, but I'd like to ask you if you would like to speculate on what's the future of sharks. And I'm not necessarily talking about what's happening in terms of climate change, but I'm thinking more about evolutionary future?
Well, they've got to survive. What's going to happen in the next 100 years before? That's a very complex question. I was always going to say they're going to develop a kind of aqualung and they're going to take over humans and, build cities and have take away human and chips kind of thing.
You heard it first here, and it's going to be on in the movies.
No, I think it's going to be many of these sharks in deeply polluted areas are clearly going to go extinct or that are overfished without regulation. I don't know. It's too hard to predict because there's too many variables. But the sharks that we actually preserve in marine environments, marine parks, are likely to survive if they've got healthy populations.
Yeah, so that's a powerful message, really, is that marine parks are one part of the conservation puzzle.
Yeah, marine parks are really, really important in managing fishing. Australia has some of the best managed fisheries in the world, I must admit. Especially we have even some of the sharks that we eat are sustainable, like the elephant fish off Victoria. It's a holocephalin, one of the early kind of Devonian offshoots that are living today. I talked to my shark experts at Flinders University, Charlie Huveniers, and he said it is a fairly well-managed population for our flake and chips. But the other danger is that other parts of the world or other parts of Australia sell flake, and it could be many species in there. The Hong Kong fish markets, they did a DNA survey of all the shark meat on sale, and about 2/3 of them were endangered species. So, certain species are all right if we can manage them, but you shouldn't just take any shark and think it's going to be okay. Yeah.
So we've got to get better ways to protect them.
The DNA work we just need to be more testing.
Is an powerful thing.
Yeah.
What would you like to have another last word about sharks and what we can learn from them?
The very last part of the book's called The Wisdom of Sharks, and I kind of speculate, what can sharks teach us humans? They've survived 5 mass extinction events where nothing else could. How did they do it? By being adaptable, by being able to adapt to a whole range of changing environments and just make the best of what they could with what was left after the devastation had cleared. And after one of those big mass extinction events, the biggest one ever, called the Great Dying at the end of the Permian 250 million years ago, sharks were tiny for 150 million years after that extinction event. And there's a lesson in that. They stayed small. They kept their resource base. They didn't, they kept to what resources were sustainable, and that's how they survived. And then later on in the age of dinosaurs, they got gigantic again when there was an abundance of food around. And some sharks, like the Greenland shark, can live for up to 500 years. So twice as old as Australia. There's probably living sharks out there in the oceans, Greenland sharks, that have been around since the Mayflower sailed over to North America. There's a lot we can learn from that. They don't even reach puberty till 150 years. It's a long time to wait for your first shave, isn't it?
150-year-old teenager.
So, we can learn a lot from sharks. They're some of the oldest sentient creatures on the planet. And there's still a hell of a lot we don't know about them. So I think I couldn't really answer that question. We need to keep studying them and learning from them. And in doing that, we're going to get unexpected benefits from those researchers.
What a wonderful way to end the talk. Thank you so much, John, for sharing your knowledge with us. Let's give him another round of applause. And thank you very much for writing this book. It's obviously a labour of love. I think everyone will enjoy reading it. If you would like to get a copy, you can go outside and...
I'll just say there was an error on the pricing before. It was the wrong price, but they've got the correct price now. It's $34 or something. It's not $44. So just letting you know.
So you can go out and John will be available to sign books and have a bit of a chat. And I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's worked on the lecture tonight. Thanks to Sam, Lara, Jess and Maya. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks for your great questions. And I hope to see you again here at Melbourne Museum. So have a great night. Thank you.